Good afternoon. I'm Keren Yarhi-Milo. I'm the Dean of the School of International Public Affairs, and I'm the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations. And welcome, everyone, to our inaugural event of the Institute of Global Politics 2024 Election Series. With this series, we are harnessing SIPA's unparalleled and convening power to bring together incredible scholars and practitioners from across the political spectrum and across the globe, and to examine the impact both locally and globally of this historic election. Please, I ask you to check your website and stay tuned for additional programming in the series. This is just the beginning. And I hope that you will be able to join us in person or on the live stream. In just 2 months, Americans will go to the polls to elect their 47th president. Now, there is a debate among political scientists over how much foreign policy matters in American presidential election. And we tend to think that most voters do not really cast their ballots because of the candidate's position on Iran or Russia or China, but rather on the issues that the policies on domestic issues. But this year's election, this question remains to be seen. A recent AP poll found that foreign policy has doubled in importance to Americans this year compared to last year, and that international issues are increasingly feeding public anxiety. We're also mindful of the fact that we are gathering on September 11th, 23 years after America came under attack in New York and Washington, D.C. I was actually a student here at SIPA on 9/11, taking classes on international relations and conflict resolutions in the Middle East. On that dark day, Americans woke up to the fact that foreign policy challenges are no longer distant problems overseas. This was also the time that I decided to be a political scientist. From the battlegrounds of Ukraine to Gaza today, to the great power competition over the global south, looming tensions over Taiwan, to the future of emerging technologies like AI, the consequences of November's elections will be far-reaching and felt by everyone across the globe. As we saw in last night's debate, how many of you watched the debate? Oh, wow, okay, you're committed, good. Voters face two stark choices. On the Republican Party side, we increasingly see some isolationist trends with faint echoes of a century ago, when American lawmakers after the First World War thought to keep America out of any global alliances and institutions. On the Democratic Party side of the ledger is a foreign policy that is arguably more status quo and mainstream, whether the issue is continued support for Ukraine or strengthening America's alliances. To make sense of these two choices, as well as the foreign policy challenges awaiting the next occupant of the Oval Office, we've gathered an exceptional group of practitioners and scholars here today. So I would like to introduce the amazing group of experts we've assembled. Ian Bremmer is a professor here at SIPA and the founder of the Eurasia group. He has written extensively on the significance of this election on U.S. role in the world, especially regarding our strategic competition with China. It is a privilege to welcome Ambassador Victoria Nuland as the newest member of our faculty here at SIPA, retiring after 3.5 decades of public service in the State Department, most recently as the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, where she spearheaded much of our Ukraine and NATO policy during the last decade. We have Corey Shaki here with us. She serves as the Director of Studies at the American Enterprise Institute and is one of the nation's foremost thinkers on American civil-military relations. She has a long and distinguished career serving both in government and election, including the architect of the Republican foreign policy positions during previous presidential campaigns. We have Tim Naftali with us today, an IGP research scholar and CNN commentator with expertise on presidential history. I want to give a special thanks to Tim for curating this election series. He's one of the country's most preeminent historians of U.S. presidents and foreign affairs. And finally, we will conclude with an interview with Secretary Wendy Sherman, the 21st U.S. Deputy Secretary of State and the first woman to hold this position. Ambassador Sherman has served under 3 presidents and 5 secretaries of state and has successfully crafted nuclear deals with both North Korea and Iran. We are absolutely thrilled to have her as an IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow this year. And I have to say, she just appeared in the class that I teach with Secretary Clinton. And boy, that was so good and could have lasted for hours. So thank you for doing this, Ambassador Sherman. And it is now my honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton, who really needs no introduction in this room. She served as this country's 67th Secretary of State, senator from New York on 9/11, and was the first woman nominee to be President of the United States. I am grateful to have her now as a professor at SIPA and the chair of the IGP Faculty Advisory Board. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Clinton.
Well, thank you very, very much, Keren. And it's a pleasure to see this room filled again as we begin the programming for IGP here at SIPA, especially during this consequential year. Like many of you, I remember exactly where I was on this day 23 years ago. I was in my first year and my first term serving as a senator from New York. I was in Washington on my way to a hearing on the Hill at the Senate. I had the news on as I was on the phone getting briefed up by my staff, and found myself in just total disbelief by what I was hearing and then what they were telling me. By the time I got to the Senate, all of the offices were being evacuated. There was reason to believe, as we knew later, that the Capitol was a target, as the Pentagon and the Twin Towers were as well. The following day, I went to Ground Zero with my colleague Chuck Schumer. It was one of the most searing experiences that I know I will ever have. The ruins that we flew over in a helicopter before landing to meet up with the then mayor and governor, to meet with first responders and other local, state, and federal officials. And much of my first term as New York Senator was focused on dealing with the aftermath, the victims, the lives lost, the continuing threats, the rebuilding of Manhattan. So I think it's especially important that we remember those Americans who lost their lives, those from many, many other countries who also perished, their families, their friends, their colleagues, and certainly the first responders and others, along with our military who fought to hold those responsible. So we can't always predict when events will turn our world upside down. This first panel of such distinguished panelists will talk about foreign affairs in this upcoming election, but I will certainly predict to you that none of them will mention something that will happen shortly after whoever is elected takes office. The first time I was ever in the Situation Room was before the inauguration of President-elect Obama. when we were told that there was a credible threat that had been picked up through intelligence against the inauguration of our new president. So I found myself in the Situation Room before I'd even become Secretary of State. I hadn't yet been even confirmed, as I recall, along with a few other officials, including then Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, who was being held over, being briefed by Condi Rice and others about this threat. That was, my first exposure to being in the Situation Room that Keren and I, now teach about in our course. So our efforts during this year, and I want to thank Tim Naftali for helping to really put this together and to use his extraordinary experience and understanding of the presidency and elections to bring to our students, to our larger community, the kinds of issues that voters and citizens, not just in this country, but around the world, should be looking at. For me, talking about foreign policy is, something that comes naturally because of my past experience. And I agree with Keren that I think probably there is more attention being paid to it, both positively and negatively, both in a sense of withdrawing from the world and hoping it will stay somewhere out there, and struggling with the difficult questions posed about how to engage with it in this election. And clearly last night we saw two very different approaches to foreign policy outlined by two very different candidates. I think it's going to be an important run-up to this election for us to keep talking about foreign policy here at SIPA, because at least we have an obligation to try to make sense of it, to try to communicate about it, to try to understand what the challenges are. It's going to be a difficult world no matter who is elected. That's something that I think we can safely believe. But we can limit or ratchet up the stresses and the challenges depending upon the choices that are made. I'm looking forward to the panel, and I'm especially looking forward after the panel to my opportunity to interview Wendy Sherman. Those of you, and I see a few familiar faces from our class who just were able to hear her speak about her work over 35 years representing the United States in North Korea, in Iran, with two efforts to restrain nuclear programs. I think you're going to have the great opportunity that we just had in class to hear from somebody who has literally been on the front lines of American diplomacy, doing everything she can to make the world safe for all of us. So again, thank you very much.
Welcome to the stage today's panelists and Timothy Naftali.
Yeah, do that. Thank you. It's okay. After Victoria.
Between the two.
It's okay. That's okay.
Cool. You don't need to hear the moderator anyway, really. Thank you, Keren. Thank you, Secretary Clinton, for the stellar introductions. We don't have a lot of time, and we have a lot of ideas. So I want to get us started. I've asked each of our three wonderful panelists the same question, and have given them a chance to prepare 3 to 4 minutes in answering this question. And the question is something I think is on most of our minds. What are the main foreign policy challenges confronting the next president, whoever it happens to be? I'll start with Corey. We'll work our way through, and then we'll start a plenary panel discussion. What do you think, Corey?
So the major long-term challenge is, what are we going to do about a China that is either successful or marooned in the middle income trap? So that's the long-term challenge. The near-term challenge is helping Ukraine defend and restore the territory that is internationally recognized as theirs from Russia's incursion. The third challenge I would put is restoring freedom of navigation, both in Asia and in the Red Sea. And the fourth would be that we are not spending enough either in defense or diplomacy to be able to carry out the strategy we say we are employing.
Cool. Ian.
I don't disagree with any of those things. I would add to that, we're in an environment where the global balance of power is increasingly misaligned with the rules of the road, with the institutions, with the architecture. So this doesn't sound very sexy, but a big priority is reforming institutions that increasingly are not fit for purpose in today's global environment, whether we're talking about the WTO, for example, or modernizing and advancing NATO, building new architecture, as we're starting to in Asia, for example, but around the world. And then a second big priority will be arms control and governance on artificial intelligence. It took us about 15 years of unfettered nuclear development between the Americans and the Soviets before we almost blew ourselves and everybody else up. And then we realized, oh, maybe we need to talk about arms control. We will not have that much time with the Chinese on AI. That is going to need to be a priority for the next president.
Ambassador Nuland, Victoria.
Thank you, Tim. Before we start, I just have to say on this September 11th for students, I was at NATO on September 11th as our deputy ambassador, and we also thought we would have a threat to NATO headquarters. But equally importantly, it was the day after September 11th that all the NATO allies invoked Article 5 of the treaty for the first time in its history. An attack on one is an attack on all, and came to our defense. And I remember as a mid-career diplomat thinking, if we ask NATO allies to invoke Article 5 and we don't have complete unity among all of them, then the day after we were hit, we will also have destroyed NATO. So it was one of the tensest but also the most rewarding moments. So forgive me that little small commercial on this day. It will not surprise you that I agree with both of the colleagues about the main challenges, but I think just as the last 4 years have been, the next 4 years will be absolutely crucial for the democratic and freedom-loving nations to win the future vis-a-vis the autocrats and those who want to roll back the rules of the road or change them in a way that will be dangerous for us. And will the U.S. continue to lead strongly in all of these things, not just in meeting the moment in terms of the attack on Ukraine and what's going on in Gaza, and ensuring that we are maximally resilient and strong vis-a-vis China, but also modernizing all of the institutions, addressing the transnational threats. But one thing we haven't mentioned enough here, I think, yet is Iran. And so many of the problems we see in the Middle East come back to the fact that Iran has been the shadow player behind all of it, behind Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, obviously its nuclear ambitions, and the next president must come up with a far more, I think, comprehensive policy vis-a-vis Iran.
You all watched the debate last night. How well do you think the candidates addressed these challenges that one of them will clearly face come January?
I thought the Vice President did a terrific job. She sounded presidential. She was detailed on border issues, for example, which I think most policy people think is her biggest vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And she didn't sound erratic and crazy as the former president did.
Oh, you mean quoting Viktor Orban as a source of legitimacy as an international statesperson wasn't good enough?
So I tense up as you say that, because I actually think the re-election of Donald Trump is a genuine danger to the Constitution in this country, and we laugh about it at our peril.
Victoria?
So when the American people think about foreign policy in the context of an election, and as Keren made clear, sometimes it's a lot and sometimes it's not a lot. Right now it's a medium lot, I would say. What are they looking for? They're looking for somebody they can trust as commander-in-chief. So I think we saw the vice president very much seeking to make clear her credentials there. And we saw the former president asserting that the world was safer on his watch. I will be interested to see which of those arguments the American people bought.
We'll go to Ian, and then I'm going to ask you all a question about deterrence. Ian, what are your thoughts?
Look, Trump has been less than coherent over the past few months at his rallies at the Economics Club here in New York. So not so surprising that he didn't do a great job sticking to one line of thought. But there were points that he made that matter on foreign policy, and they could be made more coherently in ways that I think a Harris administration will need to address. For example, you look at U.S.-China policy, there's a lot of criticism of all of these tariffs and the impact it's having on inflation, on American consumer goods and the rest, on a de facto containment policy. Trump did say, if you're really opposed to all of that, well, why didn't you do anything about it over the last 3.5 years? You haven't been opposed to it. These policies have been very similar. She doesn't have a lot of China experience. She doesn't have a good answer on that yet. She needs one. The U.S. doesn't really have market access and trade policy in its arsenal right now. That needs to be addressed. Neither of them are particularly good at that. That's increasingly becoming not an extreme, but a baseline position, and one that is driving the Americans and the Europeans apart, not just the Americans and the Chinese. Then you have the issue of Russia. And a place that Trump could have made some points, if he could have stuck on line and on message, is when they asked, do you want Ukraine to win?
Yeah.
And when he basically said, no, I want the war to end. And by the way, a lot of Americans are aligned with that. They support Ukraine, but they want the war to end. And increasingly, that's a position that resonates with lots of other countries around the world. And addressing what's going to happen in a Ukraine that is unlikely to be able to take all of their land back, even though most people in this room, and certainly all of our colleagues here, would want them to be able to, that's something that Biden hasn't been able to address, and Harris, as vice president, is part of that administration. So she clearly won, but I don't think that we're yet at the point that we can say she's able to outline and articulate good responses to all those questions.
So let's look at that question first about addressing the American desire, and it's not just an American desire, to see an end to the war. How should our next president explain the role that the United States should play in ending a war between two other people that involves the sovereignty of one of those two states?
So I think in two ways. First, we're not neutral as to how this war ends. So we're not a natural arbiter of it. We are a supporter of the government of Ukraine on this. And so forcing people who want the war to end to explain how the war ends without Ukraine losing, I think is really important, because I don't think there's a way the war ends until Russia loses. The second thing is, when I talk to my dad's Rotary Club in Sonoma, California, the argument that gets the most traction with those great community members and small business owners is that for 5% of US defense spending last year and 0 American casualties, Ukraine is destroying the Russian military that is a threat to us and our 31 other NATO allies. That's actually a great investment on the part of the United States, not just in making Europe safer, but in making us safer.
This is
You have been the architect of so much goodness on this.
Thank you.
Friend.
Listen, this was part of why the last $60 billion for Ukraine passed in April, because $50 billion of that goes right back into the US economy to replace the weapons that we've given to Ukraine with the next generation. And this creates jobs all over the country, and members of the Senate and the House understood that. But equally importantly, the interesting thing here is I think Ukraine's a real vulnerability for Donald Trump in the way he answered last night, that he couldn't say what side he was on. He's going to end the war, but he doesn't say how. The American people the numbers are actually going up in terms of support for Ukraine and contempt for Putin, because Americans understand that if you don't stop Putin here, he will keep going, and autocrats around the world will be emboldened, and we will live in a different kind of world. So that is not a new concept, and also they don't like a bully. So this is the issue. Trump likes to say there was no war on his watch, but Putin spent the 4 years of that administration preparing for this, and there was not any advancement in the diplomacy at that time either. But I think it's an equal issue for Vice President Harris if she wins, because she's not going to want to spend 4 years in this conflict. So I would argue that it would be in her interest to ensure that Ukraine succeeds faster and gives Putin that bloody nose that he needs to decide this whole war wasn't worth it. And then you can have a conversation about peace.
Ian.
Now, of course, there was a war in Ukraine under Trump, and there was a war in Ukraine under Obama, and the Americans and the Europeans just didn't do very much in response to it, which allowed Putin to feel like he had a blinking yellow light, if not a green. But I mean, I fear that not only does a Harris administration or Trump administration not want to spend 4 years fighting this war, I don't think the Ukrainians are capable of fighting this war for 4 years. They don't. And that's of course the critical issue. You look at Ukrainian polls recently, and increasingly surprising numbers of them are saying, yeah, we got to find a way to engage because this is going to crush us. And over 50%, some 65%, I think, said that they thought it was ethically acceptable for Ukrainians to dodge mobilization. Not because they don't think their war is righteous. This isn't like Vietnam. They all think the war is righteous, but they're worried about their kids, right? They're humans. And I fear that in the United States, we have portrayed the Ukrainians occasionally as superhuman, which is a problem for them over the medium term as they reach the limits of their capacity. But look, I think the way that we try to frame this is that even if the Ukrainians can't take their territory back, and they're doing things that are increasingly desperate, like the Kursk operation, which is taking troops away from their frontline territory so that they can have a little more leverage, hopefully, big risk, is that there needs to be consistent and committed diplomatic support so that Ukraine can actually continue EU integration, economic support so that they can rebuild, including critical infrastructure that Russia is very happily destroying every day, and security commitments so that non-occupied Ukraine has firm capacity to resist, to deter and resist future Russian efforts to attack it. And those three issues need to be worked on by America in concert with allies. The worry I have about Trump is not that his people will be uninterested in that, but rather that he will approach them unilaterally as opposed to multilaterally, and this will not work if the Americans are not coordinating with allies and coordinating with the Ukrainians. He can't just make a phone call to Zelensky and Putin and think this is going to get fixed.
Tori, you mentioned, thank you, Ian. Tori, you mentioned giving Putin a bloody nose. Are there places where we could help the Ukrainians escalate to take advantage of weaknesses on the Russian side as a way of the conflict forward? Are there some places where we have been a little bit too worried about crossing a line when the Russians historically are bluffers?
Well, the most obvious one, and I hope that it gets resolved in the next few days, there's some feeling in the ether that it might, is to allow the Ukrainians, not just around Kharkiv, but wherever they need to use American long-range weapons from Ukraine to hit Russian military bases and installations that are firing at them. And, this has been one of the constraints that has not made a lot of sense to me. I also think that things that are vanity projects for Putin in the way the long-range weapons are used that are going to make it harder for him to resupply his troops. And then the last thing is the Kursk incursion into Russia. There's a reason the Ukrainians didn't ask U.S. what we thought about it beforehand, because we might have tried to stop them, but it's had a very, very profound effect, not just on those communities, but on the Russian military, on the Russian population. And the Ukrainian aspiration is to continue to create a longer buffer zone around their country, force the Russians to stand back further, and I think we should help them do that.
Corey.
I can't improve on that.
Cool. Ian?
I'm fine. We'll keep going.
Let's talk about China. How would you like to balance our economic interests in China and our interest in an international economy that isn't beggar thy neighbor, with a strategic approach to preventing China from controlling pipelines, strategic pipelines that matter to our force prediction capabilities?
Look, I mean, the theory has been, first of all, I think that I give the Biden administration very strong marks in the last year for actually working on the relationship, for engaging consistently at the high level across cabinet and at the state-to-state level. That was not happening in the Trump administration. It was not happening at the beginning of the Biden administration. So don't underestimate the fact that sometimes you just need to work on the relationship, show some respect. I think that's paid some dividends. But the broader strategic issues, supposedly, this is meant to be red, yellow, green light. Some areas that we're going to be fighting and we're adversaries, they're zero-sum. Some where we have differences, but we should be able to find areas to work together, and some that are truly collaborative. But the Chinese, increasingly, what they see is containment. And they don't see small garden, high fence. What they see is arbitrary garden, high fence, and the arbitrary garden keeps getting bigger. So, I mean, is the TikTok really something that the Americans should be trying to ban or not? But they've not been consistent on this, and in the way that they have talked about it, in the way that they have tried to implement it. For example, should there be 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs? And is that as strategic as the issues that have been brought up, for example, by Kurt Campbell on not just dual use, but actual Chinese military support directly for the Russians, or chips that actually are used for military purposes by China? I think we have not done a good job in defining what national security interests long-term are and what that means for competing zero-sum with the Chinese. I think more definition of that and sticking to that in execution would pay benefits to the United States with its allies and with the Chinese long-term.
Oh, I disagree with that. Should I jump in?
Please.
Look, I think what gets lost in all of our concern about China, that consumer goods in agriculture remains one of the largest on the planet. Needed. What we have focused on, and what was not focused on in the 4 years of tariffing and all of those kinds of things, was trying to ensure that our own economy is not monopolized by China, particularly in the high-tech area. So the Chinese had managed to garner a monopoly on rare earth metals, on chips, all these kinds of things. So we've spent an inordinate amount of time on a very small number of products that we can't afford to have the Chinese monopolize, and not only try to build them ourselves again, but get European allies, whether they are Japan, Korea, the Europeans building them with us, work with countries from Brazil to South Africa to Serbia to have other sources of rare earth metals. And on the EV side, it is not about trying to deny China a market for a consumer good that is a car. It is about the fact that whether it's Chinese EVs or it is TikTok, it is a great sucking sound for Chinese intelligence and AI and quantum and all that if they have everybody's data that they would get these ways. And so I think actually it is a relatively small garden. Is the fence high enough, I think, is the bigger question, and is it multilateral enough?
Corey, do you want to do some gardening?
You know, George Shultz used to say that
Yes.
the way to do American diplomacy is to be a gardener, to pull up weeds while they're shoots before they become a big problem, and I still think that's the right approach. I think we had China wrong, but for the reason we had it wrong, which is American foreign policy. We have a vision that's positive for ourselves and positive for others. And I think several American administrations did have a vision of a strong, prosperous China that fit into an international order. That's clearly not what the Chinese government wants. That's not a good enough answer for them. But the fact that we had a generous approach initially actually made it easier for other countries to help support us now that the hard stuff has to start happening. And the hard stuff has to start happening because of China's behavior, not because of American policy choices. China has activated the antibodies against their continued success by the way they have weaponized economic interdependence. And it's coming to a close not just because of American policy, but because the Japanese have had it used against them, the Australians have had it used against them, the Norwegians have had it used against them. We're not the only people driving Chinese isolation. The main driver is actually China's choices.
Go ahead, you want to?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm in the minority in this one. I respect that. I agree strongly with Corey's formulation that we were wrong for the right reasons, which is wanting to have a more positive vision is important. I would add to that, though, number one, that China is in a much weaker structurally economic position right now than they have been in the last 5, 10, 20 years. That gives the United States more flexibility in how it wants to approach policy towards China and vis-a-vis other countries that are linked to China than they have historically. Look at a tiny country like the Maldives that's now flipping to India because they know that they can't engage with the Chinese the way they want to. This is happening all over the place. So there's more positive capacity for the Americans with those countries. And number two, that long-term American investment in the United States, more carrot for American investment like CHIPS Act, less immediate knee-jerk, we're going to hit the Chinese, I think will pay dividends. That hasn't been the approach that particularly we see in Congress towards China, and I think that that ultimately hurts us. I would have liked to have seen a lot more focus on American EVs that are as competitive as Chinese EVs. They're not close to that right now.
You just gave me the great segue because I wanted to talk about sticks and you've talked about carrots. You mentioned, Corey, that you think we're not spending enough on defense. Is one of your concerns that we don't have the capacity to deter a Chinese attack against Taiwan? What is the reason that you believe we need to spend more on defense?
So I think we are deterring a Chinese attack on Taiwan. Every single day that it doesn't happen, I think you can thank the strength of the American nuclear as well as conventional deterrent. But China has 390 ships in its navy. China has 370 ships in its navy. The US has 291. And we're the ones who have to traverse the Pacific to be able to help our allies in Asia. Chinese shipbuilding has 270 times the capacity of American shipyards. This is going to be a problem if we don't fix it, and we need to fix it.
I would just add to that we are in a moment on this planet which is not rare, but it's heightened, where you've got a large number of large dissatisfied powers with the status quo, right? The Chinese are not happy, the Russians are not happy, the Iranians are not happy, and they're contesting to change the rules of the road. So are we actually ready and resourced, not only on the military side. I agree with Corey, we've got to be extremely vigilant about maintaining strong defense budgets, the way we spend them for the next generation of stuff, not the old generation of stuff, for stuff that is fleeter and easier to use and not, so clunky and takes 15 years to build. But we've also got to set the example for other democracies and help them to be ready to share the burden. And we're having this conversation about European defense again, about Japan and Korea taking more of the burden. We're doing more now with Australia than we've ever done, with India than we've ever done. And that is a strength for us, that we can do it together with allies. But by the same token, you see the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians banding together to help Putin have the arsenal he needs. Chinese may not be shipping weapons, but they're shipping all the Lego pieces for weapons. And so the competition is also on that front as well.
I want to ask you about a piece of the axis of chaos, the Iranians, because you mentioned Iran as a major challenge for the next president. What steps is the Biden administration not taking that you would want a future administration to take vis-a-vis Iran?
I mean, the Biden administration, to its credit, tried mightily to put the nuclear threat from Iran back in its box. But that's obviously, as we see now, not the full extent of it. And the Iranians have spent a huge amount of time and resource acquiring very capable proxies all over the world, as we talked about at the beginning. And it's all to the detriment of the Iranian people as well, who are not living well. So can we put more constraints? Can we make it clear that we are prepared to do what it takes to take care of these things? I mean, in a certain way, we have self-deterred, and we're particularly self-deterred at this moment as we head towards an election in the messages that we're sending to Iran. Just don't go this far. But what about rolling back what they've already done?
Corey?
Also, we used to be good at political warfare. I mean, the Iranian government is considered largely illegitimate by its own population, and they are about to face a political transition when the supreme leader dies. And that's fertile ground for mischief making that forces them to have to play defense, and we ought to do more of that. And
not know about it. Do you want to say something, Ian, about that?
No, I'm good on this one.
All right, well, let's move to another part of the Middle East. What shift, change, or continuation would you like to see in the U.S. policy towards the Israel-Hamas war by the next administration?
This is a genuinely hard one for me, because I don't think anybody's military is good at urban warfare. And so while I grieve what Palestinians are suffering, I struggle to think about how Israel can make its citizens and its state secure while Hamas continues to operate in Gaza. So I don't have a great solution to it, but I don't think anybody's got a great solution to it.
This is one where, and I think I give Biden a lot of credit after the Russians invaded Ukraine, that every step he was taking was in coordination with a very large alliance that had very different perspectives, very different economic vulnerabilities to that war, and it was managed extremely well. The response to October 7th and to the war in Gaza and to the increasing violence by Israeli settlers and IDF against Palestinians in the West Bank has been American unilateralism to a great degree. It has not been coordinated with allies, either Gulf allies or allies in Europe, and I think that's a mistake. I don't want to see the Americans voting by themselves at the Security Council. I don't want to see the Americans on the wrong side of the world of the International Court of Justice. I think that if you focus on rule of law, and look, Lord knows the United States often does not walk the talk when it comes to representative democracy, but nonetheless, we're doing a hell of a lot better than the Iranians are, or Hamas is, or the Russians are. Then you need to do it collectively with countries that are standing for rule of law and that have something to say about this. And that's where I think Biden has had a serious problem in part because he wanted to do this quietly, not embarrassing a friend, and playing nice with Netanyahu. And I think that's come and bit him in the ass, frankly. I think that's really been hard for him.
Keren and I had this conversation this morning. We are stuck. I agree with the administration and the president that the right answer would be a deal that gets the hostages home, that ensures that Israeli security, rebuilds Gaza, gets normalization done, and gets us to a Palestinian state. That is a win-win-win-win-win for everybody, except Mr. Sinwar, wherever the heck he is, who, is making his name on this thing, and perhaps for Mr. Netanyahu. So that calculation, or those two individuals, have to be encouraged to end the mutual assured destruction that's going on. I don't think either one of them is going to move before the US election, but this needs to be an immediate recalibration by whomever wins.
We received some excellent questions from students. Sadly, there's not enough time to ask all of them. I'm going to ask two from some IGP student scholars. The first one is, and just any of you please pick it up, how can the United States effect a sustained pivot to Asia while still maintaining commitments to allies in Europe and the Middle East?
Can I just say I hate the word pivot?
Don't take it personally.
I'm not talking to you and not to you. We are the United States of America. We must be able to walk, chew gum, juggle, stand on our head all at the same time if we aspire to global leadership and with the natural gifts and power that we have. So when people say pivot to Asia, when Asianists say pivot to Asia, that means pay more attention to those relationships. I think the knitting that has been done over the last 4 years, and I give Deputy Secretary Sherman a huge amount of credit for this, getting Japan and Korea back together, the building of new alliances with the Asian Quad, now putting the Asian Quad together with Europeans is really, really important. But this stuff has to be continued. You finally have Asian countries really working together on resilience. The Japanese working with the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese looking for how they can have better trade relations with Korea and Japan rather than being dependent on China. So all of that has to continue, but we also have to do the same in Europe. If Europe doesn't grow, get back to growing. If it cannot help sustain the Ukrainians in their fight with Putin, if we are not all helping the global south get a better deal than what the autocrats are offering, then it's not going to be the future that we want. So we've got to do everything at the same time. I'm sorry.
No, don't be sorry. I'm sorry that the question about India wasn't posed. Perhaps in the spotlight they will talk about India. I want to thank Ian, Toria, and Corey for a spectacular panel and a great start to our election programming this year. And now for the main event.
Thank you, Tim.
Wonderful job.
Welcome to the stage, Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton and IGP Carnegie Distinguished Fellow, Ambassador Wendy Sherman.
First of all, thanks. Thank you. Thanks to the panel, and thanks for your, very candid conversation and even disagreements. That was very, very helpful in, putting the issues into context and demonstrating the difficulty of a lot of these decisions. Well, I could not be happier today than I am because I get to interview Wendy Sherman. When one thinks about major foreign policy events over the last 35 years, I think it's fair to say that hardly anybody, I can't think of anybody, who's had more involvement in these very difficult issues than she has. And I want to get right into it because I don't know if I can get to India, but I'll try. That wasn't on my my list.
Try to throw it in.
Yeah, we'll try to throw it in there. If I'm not going to take time going over Wendy's illustrious career, just Google her and you'll see everything she's done. But in your memoir, Wendy, you write about the requirements, the challenges of coming to consensus, and in your diplomatic career, you have skillfully managed the process of seeking and finding consensus with two of our country's most difficult adversaries, North Korea and Iran. We will get to each of those in a minute, but I wanted to ask you, what lessons do you think current diplomats perhaps could draw to deal with the two issues our panelists just tackled, namely achieving outcomes that are sustainable, whether it's a ceasefire and then the day after in Gaza, or a resolution victory for Ukraine in the war there. As you're looking forward to whoever becomes president, what would you suggest be done to try to set up the conditions for dealing with those two issues, which I fear will still be with us?
Thank you. First of all, my hat's off to the panel that just spoke. I've learned from every single person who is on that panel, served with Toria, of course, for quite some time, and but have known Corey and Ian and have come to know the great historian, Mr. Naftali. So thank you very much. I took notes. Second, as I said to Secretary Clinton, I find this incredibly awkward. I should be interviewing her, not the other way around. She's heard me say that already once today, but that's the way I feel. But nonetheless, I'll try to answer your questions. Each situation is sui generis. So although I believe we can learn lessons, and we should, we also shouldn't overlearn lessons, as if what happens in Ukraine can tell us what to do in the Middle East or vice versa. It doesn't work that way. There are different players. There are different moments in history. History is really important for context. There are different cultures. There are different personalities. And so each situation you have to, I taught a course, at another school, that was called Away from the Table, to teach students that everybody wants to be in the negotiating room as if that's where it's all going to happen, if I don't learn how to be in the negotiation room. But it's actually all the things outside of the room. It's the context, it's the history, it's the strategy, it's the technical understanding, it's the personalities, it's the culture. All of that, it's the preparation that gets you there. It's not, being inside the room is hard work, and it's important, but the context matters enormously. So say that, first of all. Second, in the Middle East, which I've also had the experience to be part of at various times, Wye River and the Syrian non-negotiation that we had in Shepherdstown, which was quite something. We had Shabbat with the Israelis and Golan Heights wine, and we had Eid with the Syrians the next day, with no wine, of course. So we are in a very difficult situation in the Middle East. We only have so many levers. I think the previous panel said it exactly right. You cannot get to a conclusion unless the leaders want to get to the conclusion. And we appear to be at a place where the two, hate to call Sinwar a leader, he's a terrorist. But nonetheless, he is the other side of the table. And the Prime Minister of Israel, for what their own reasons, don't seem to want to get there. So we put on as much pressure as we can. Yes, I agree, one needs to do this with the Gulf states. One needs to do this with the broader community. We have done some of that, perhaps not enough, but some of that. But at the end of the day, we can't change everybody's politics in the world, and there are politics here for everyone. So we need to keep pushing. I thought it was very interesting, this trial balloon. Trial balloons are very important in negotiations. We certainly sent many up, both in North Korea, Iran, and in the Middle East. And another one's been floated that Sinwar would get assurances to be able to get safe harbor in Qatar if he would only return the hostages. I don't know if Sinwar would ever believe those assurances, something that got discussed today in Keren and the Secretary's class. But nonetheless, interesting. What I think that tells you about doing any negotiation is open the vision. See what else there might be. We now, I said this earlier today, we now have AI. There's a lot of dangers to AI, but I'd go to AI and say, what ideas you got that maybe somebody else can float or that we could use to see whether there might be other possibilities. On Ukraine, I have to take off my hat to Ambassador Nuland. The reason everybody's kept together is because she has 7:30 phone calls with the G7, had 7:30 a.m. phone calls with the G7 every single day. You cannot do tough diplomacy without calls every single day. It just, in something this tense and this consequential. So I think we learn from any successful diplomacy. It takes really hard work and persistence. It takes courage. We talked earlier today in the Iran negotiation. You had the courage, along with President Obama, to begin a secret set of bilateral negotiations to see if there was anything there that had a lot of risk to it. It took courage. It was an understanding of how much power we had to, in fact, do that, but also what the limitations of our power were. We couldn't do it in public or it would be dead before we could even get started. And we understood that we had to persist, that none of these things get resolved easily. I agree, I don't think on the Middle East until after our election there is a way to get there, unless the leaders decide otherwise. And on Ukraine, God willing, more and more can happen in the way they have in the past few days. And we can get to a different place and change the strategic choices that people are currently making.
You know, when you were talking about persistence, it struck me how I suggested to President Obama that he asked George Mitchell to be our envoy for the Middle East, and he agreed. And George quickly went out to visit not just Israel, not just go to Ramallah to see the Palestinian Authority, not just to the Gulf, but to Brussels and everywhere else. And when he came back, he told us that he'd given a speech, I think, at Hebrew University, because he was, of course, chosen in large measure because of his great success in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, and he was talking about the lessons that he had learned and the importance of persistence. And he said that after the speech, a gentleman in the audience came up and talked to him. And he said, "No, wait a minute. You negotiated the deal in Northern Ireland, right?" And he goes, yes. "And you're here now to help us in the Middle East?" He goes, "Yes." He said, "What makes you think such an easy conflict like Northern Ireland would have any lessons for us?" So, there's also the problem with people in the middle of these situations not thinking there's anything like what they are going through. And of course, there is nothing like negotiating with North Korea. The so-called hermit kingdom, a place that very few people have ever been. You have been there. You've been to Pyongyang. And so you were instrumental in the agreed framework to convince the North Koreans to end their plutonium program, which lasted for 8 years, which, was quite an accomplishment. And we talked in some detail in our class about it ending and the consequences, but I have a different sort of a question about it. What should the next president, whoever it is, think about the relationship, not just between us and North Korea, but between Moscow and Pyongyang, between Beijing and Pyongyang, between Seoul and Tokyo? How would you see the next president crafting a smart, strategic approach to North Korea at this point?
Really simple question. Yeah. So, again, things have changed dramatically from when the agreed framework, which Bob Gallucci negotiated, the missile deal that I was working on with President Clinton and with Secretary Albright, that took me to Pyongyang a couple of times, working with the former Secretary of Defense, Bill Perry, and then with Secretary Albright. The context has changed because we now have Iran, Russia, North Korea, and China working together in a variety of ways. And Russia, which was immensely helpful in the Iran deal, Sergei Ryabkov, someone many of us know quite well, has immense technical ability as well as diplomatic ability, and helped manage that multi-party negotiation and helped us get to a deal. I can't talk to him anymore because we don't have that kind of relationship. We still have channels to Russia, ones that people could probably imagine, but it's not the usual diplomatic channels. Russia is getting material and missiles from Iran. They're getting a lot of help from North Korea. North Korea is getting help from Russia. Indeed, I had forgotten until I was getting ready to come here that Iran gave missiles to North Korea long ago, decades ago. So these are long-standing relationships. And China, of course, is at least sending, as Toria said, the Lego pieces, if not more now, to Russia. And the only good that's coming out of this new set of strategic relationships is that China, I think, is a little annoyed with Russia for cozying up to North Korea, because North Korea is their client state, not Russia's client state. And it used to be in negotiations on Iran, China would come in behind Russia. On North Korea, Russia would come in behind China. That's changed. That creates some possibilities, particularly since we've built a floor under our relationship with China. I hope it lasts more than 5 minutes, but at least there's some plywood, not mahogany yet, but some plywood underneath our feet. We have a mill-mill relationship now with China, which is critically important. So maybe there are pieces of this puzzle, as complex as it is now, for us to play with and to think about, to change people's calculus to deal with this. North Korea right now is virtually an immovable problem. They have multiple nuclear weapons. They have the means to deliver those nuclear weapons, and I don't read intelligence anymore. I'm glad about that most days, because they're really horrible things in intelligence. It made me think every morning, which embassies was I going to have to suggest had to close, or at least let people go home because they face danger, particularly Piquant today on 9/11. So this is going to be very hard to figure out what to do with North Korea. I'm not sure there's any simple answer here, because I don't know that anybody, if Kim Jong-un decided tomorrow he wanted to use a nuclear weapon, I'm not sure anyone could deter him. Anyone.
Well, I think that's the critical ending point, because we used to think that if push really came to shove, China could deter them. They were dependent upon China. There was a lot of pressure that China could pose, not just economically, but also militarily. But it wasn't by accident that Kim Jong-un got into his train and went to Moscow, or went to Vladivostok, or wherever he met Putin. So I think you're right to point out that what was a complex problem has become even more so. Now, you also have the extraordinary experience negotiating with the Iranians over the nuclear deal. And again, we talked in class about the reasons why we did that deal, started doing it shortly after President Obama was sworn in. I became Secretary of State. We were looking for a different way to try to engage with Iran, to try to put their nuclear program in the box that was referred to in the earlier panel. But even since you negotiated, and certainly since former President Trump pulled us out of the agreement, collapsing it, removing our capacity to have literally eyes on the nuclear program, it appears as though Iran has gotten even more aggressive internationally. And I wanted to ask you, based on your experience, and in fact, the two men that you negotiated primarily with, one is now the foreign minister and one, I guess, is the deputy foreign minister in the new Iranian government. So you have probably more personal experience with these two men than any other American. And what do you make of Iran's behavior in the Israel-Hamas war this far? And what, if anything, has surprised you about its stance? And how do you think about this new presidential leadership? Does it make any difference, or are we just still basically seeing the Potemkin village behind which is the supreme leader, and nothing about that has changed?
So because there's a supreme leader, he does get the final say, but there are politics in Iran. They are not without politics. And there's certainly politics between what we used to call the ties, because they were all guys, the diplomats, and the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, who are really the hardliners in Iran. I don't speak of reformers when I talk about Iran. Other people do. I just talk about hardliners and hardliners. So the president, the new president, is ostensibly a hardliner, not a hardliner. But he didn't get to run for president except that the Guardian Council, which is controlled by the supreme leader, said he could be on the ballot. So you have to have revolutionary bona fides to even be on the ballot. Nonetheless, Zarif, who was the foreign minister and was John Kerry's counterpart and lived in this country for 30 years, and it understands America quite well, even though he does have revolutionary bona fides. He is now the vice president for strategic thinking. Abbas Araghchi is the foreign minister, who is my primary counterpart, and Majid Takhravanchi, who was their ambassador to the UN, and before that, Abbas Araghchi's deputy during the negotiation, and actually the lead on the humanitarian channel to get our hostages out. That was Majid's lead, not Abbas's. They're now the foreign ministry. Will this make any difference? I don't know. There is no question that Iran has funded, trained, supplied weapons, and more intelligence to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to Syria, to the Houthis. I think that Iran is not, this is my own view, and this is just my fingertips, and I have fewer of them now that I'm out of government. I don't think Hamas did everything it's done because Iran told them to do it. I think they were doing this for their own reasons and their own strategic calculation. Doesn't mean Iran isn't behind the scenes. They are. But I think Hamas did this for their own reasons. So that means that it's harder to sort of lever Iran and what we want from them to get them to put pressure on Hamas or Hezbollah. What I do believe is Hamas does not want a wider war because they would be in really bad shape. Hezbollah does not want a wider war because it would cost them a great deal, even though they have precision-guided missiles and a lot of capability. And we're talking about asymmetric warfare, which Corey knows much more about than I do. Israel does not want a wider war, and Iran does not want a wider war. That's all the good news. The bad news is it doesn't take much for something to happen unintentionally for there to be a wider war. So I agree with what the panel said earlier, that we need a broad strategy that looks at all the elements of what Iran is doing. In this new strategic calculus of the countries that have this, what were you calling an alliance of chaos? And what tools we have at our disposal to try to change things. We can't go back to the JCPOA. They've enriched to 60% on their way to 90%. They have these new relationships. They economically are having a hard time, but they're able to get a lot of money from oil because China and Russia don't really care about our sanctions. Doesn't matter, no matter how we try to enforce it. So there are things we can do here. And the last thing I would say is if someone says to me, should we talk to them? I would say probably, but I'd want to know a whole lot more than I currently can know. But I would do it very warily, with eyes wide open, and probably initially in secret.
Yeah, I think, that's very good advice. I don't know, under which circumstances now that would be possible to whoever the next president is, but I think that kind of exploration would be at least worthy of consideration. At the very end, somebody mentioned India, and we too often don't spend enough time talking about India or much of Africa or Latin America. And whether we either acknowledge it or not, there is a very significant competition for influence going on in the rest of the world. And it's not just influence in the old Cold War days between the United States, Russia, and to some extent China. Iran is vying for influence dramatically as well. So could you just, maybe start with India, but just talk a little bit about, the concerted effort that other countries are making. I mean, Russia uses kind of brute force, the Wagner army, their efforts to seize assets like gold and territory and influence. China uses its, Belt and Road money to try to win hearts and minds by building roads and soccer stadiums and all the rest of it. Iran increasingly is using both, money and presence to influence players. So maybe just give us a quick overview on that.
That was a great rundown of the ways in which these countries are trying to do this. I think we spent a lot of time in this administration trying to think of a new name for the Global South, because they're not all in the South. And nobody's thought of a better name. We tried all different kinds of things, but the point is that start from a different place. The Security Council at the United Nations used to be the place where big business was done. It can't be done there anymore because Russia and China won't play in any way that's constructive. So the UN General Assembly has become more of the go-to place at the United Nations to try to move an agenda. Then you're talking about 187 countries. So it's a lot of hard work, and those 187 countries have a lot of power now. So small countries or groups of countries like Pacific Island nations or the African nations or LATAM, India, very much so, have now power they never had before. The United States has long been a believer that there should be a reform of the UN Security Council, in part, largely driven by India and Japan, both countries who believe they should be permanent members of the Security Council. Brazil also believes it should be a permanent member of the Security Council, and there are others who believe so as well. We have said we believe the Security Council should be increased. The world has changed. That's the most visual, permanent way to acknowledge that change. It would have a tremendous effect down the line, I believe. I think the most likely change, which I don't know if we'll see in my lifetime, but I think it will happen at some point, is the 5 permanent members from the beginning maintain their veto power. There may be 5 new permanent members, but without a veto power. And then there are maybe 5 rotating members, so you have 15 again, but with different status than in the past. And the reason I start with the UN is because that was the construction after World War II to try to represent the interests of the world, not just the 5 biggest powers, and who were all nuclear powers, of course, which is why they're the permanent members of the Security Council. And the world has changed dramatically. So India, I think I've always been a big believer in India. They are now the largest country, the wealthiest, largest group of wealthy people, the largest group of poor people, the largest middle class, the largest illiterate population, and maybe the largest literate population, just because they are now the largest population in the world. So they have technological capacity. You know, I'm sure you remember Y2K. We would have never gotten through Y2K without Indian technologists who came to the United States to help us. We were terrified that, you know, the computers would go over to the new century and we'd be in big trouble. We see, the last thing I'll say is we see, I have traveled to many, 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 many countries all over the world, and many in the global south are skeptical of the permanent members. They see us all using them to compete with each other without being cognizant of their interests and what they need. And we do that at our peril.
Well, you know, among the many challenges that we are facing Among the many challenges we are facing are some of these transnational global ones, whether it's climate change, migration, technology, especially with respect to warfare, artificial intelligence. And there seems to be either very little appetite or very little ability by the international community to come together to deal with this. I would add, you know, the weaponization of space, which is a particular problem. And you mentioned the UN, and people, you know, dismiss the UN and all the rest of it. But the UN was there for a purpose, and there are lots of agreements and work that is done every day, whether it's, you know, to run the airline industry, the mail service. There are all these UN programs that connect with things we just literally take for granted. But when you look at these international challenges that I just mentioned, do you see any hope that we can get the world together again, given the divisiveness that exists on so many other fronts, to deal with them, to do something about it before, it's really way too late?
I have to have hope. I'm an optimist. Madeleine Albright, who I had the pleasure to call friend as well as boss, as well as business partner, you know well, she used to say, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. I thought it was a great description of what we all have to do, which is to look for the light, work as hard as we can. I called that memoir Not for the Faint of Heart, because all of this work is not for the faint of heart. It's really tough. The odds are great. The failures are often. The successes are fewer, but unbelievably critical and meaningful. And you and I have talked about this before. I've got grandchildren. You have grandchildren. I see that I can call on my 10-year-old grandson to help me with my technology because I haven't a clue, and he knows everything. The world is going to be theirs, and it's going to be different, and I want them to have one. So I'm going to do everything I can. I hope all of you. And one of the reasons that I've come to Columbia, and my guess is part of your reason too, is you all are the future. I'm not. I'm not. I hope to be a part of it for as long as I possibly can, but I'm counting on all of you to find these answers, to understand this new world, which is pretty profound. So thank you in advance for making sure my grandsons can grow up in a really fabulous world.
Well, thank you for everything you've done over your long and storied career to make that world safer and more optimistic. This is, as Keren said in the beginning, the first of our special events that IGP will do in the lead up to the election. If you have ideas that you would like us to cover, or programs or people to invite, we would really love to have those. I guess in conclusion, to kind of follow up and end on what Wendy said, there is no doubt that this election will very much set the stage for whether we deal with any of these problems or whether we deal with them in a smart, effective way. So those of you who are eligible to vote in this election, I hope that you'll take, if not my advice, Taylor Swift's, and get registered and vote. I just saw that literally in her Instagram endorsement from last night and her reference to registering to vote, something like 333 million people, or no, that's too much. More than 3 million, huge numbers. I'm losing track of what the numbers are, but they were big, have already taken her up on that. And really, that's all we can ask for, because as Wendy said, we have a lot more yesterdays than tomorrows, and so we've got to do everything we can to support young people in being invested in our future and doing everything you can. And we have an amazing student body here at SIPA, people from all over the world who want to help make a difference. So I guess just finally, whatever you do, whatever you study, make space for being a citizen, make space for being engaged in the world and looking for a way to find solutions to make it better. Thank you all very much.